Hello? Yes. So, last lecture we talked about email security, but we were not finished with it, so we have a few things left to discuss. And we'll back up a little bit. I inserted some new slides in the presentation to make it even more clear. So, what we are is in this situation now. We have the sender, receiver, and we have the main components here of the email system with the different mail transfer agents, as they are called, MTAs. The sender and receiver mail transfer agent, and we have the DNS server as an help system that we can use. And then we said that the earlier protocols we talked about for security, like PGP and SMIME, they are talking about end-to-end delivery. So they are from the sender all the way to the receiver and try to add different types of protection on that. Confidentiality and authentication mainly. But in many cases we don't have PGP or SMIME, which means that when users are sending email, it's in clear text, which means that in that case we have this eavesdropper who can listen to the traffic. We also added the domain keys standard to help a sender take responsibility for the mail, so we can check that it actually came from a certain sender and so on. And again, that doesn't help with the transport of securing the transport of email. So that's why we have this DANE. The idea with DANE and also the next one, the strict SMS transport security, they are very similar actually. They both have this idea that we should protect the email while it's on transmission between sender and receiver mail server. But they do it in a little bit different ways. So if you talk about the DANE first then, it's built, well, as the name says, DNS-based authentication. So, as I said already last time, we are removing the burden of authenticating the server from the CA to the DNS server instead. So we to rely on who the other side is, we say that, okay, let's get that information from a DNS server instead of relying on a certificate authority signing a certificate. So in general, what happens here with DANE is that when we try to send the email, the mail server here will ask its own DNS server about who is on the other side. Do we know anything about that one? And of course, this DNS server will ask the DNS server, it's not in this figure, but that the mail server is using, the authoritative mail server for that domain, about the information about it. And then that authoritative name server may say that, yes, I'm using DANE. And they do that by having a special record in the DNS server for DANE one, which is called TLS-A. So then we know, okay, we should protect the transmission using actually TLS. And from the DNS server we also get a policy about how we should protect it. So that's how we ask it. The DNS system is returning us information about, okay, we should use DANE and how we should use it. And then after that we actually do, I don't have that either here. Well, I have it, I think, on the last slide. What we do is we ask for a start TLS. So we send that message to the other side, and the other side, since its policy in the DNS server says yes, we should protect it, should respond with a TLS. Yes, let's create a TLS tunnel here. And then we can check the certificate that is used to protect that tunnel against the information we get from a DNS system to match it, to make sure that yes, the server that is responding on the other side is actually the same one that the DNS service system says it should be. So we can match it. And the security here is that anyone can fake a certificate, but not anyone can administrate the DNS, cannot be authoritative for that DNS. So as long as you have control over the DNS, you're secure. Strict transport security is very similar, but as you see, it comes from another, well, there are other people behind it. So DANE is a standard that came from Europe, and it's a few years old, while strict STS is a newer standard, and it's, as you see, promoted by some of the big American IT companies. But the purpose is really the same, to protect the transport between sender and receiver mail server. And how you do it is also the same. You do it with setting up a TLS tunnel. It's just the way that it's established that is different. So instead of relying on DNS here, you get information from what you call a policy server. You have to set up a specific, a separate policy server here. So whenever you ask the mail server and it says, yes, I'm using strict SMS, SMTP, STS, then you should ask this policy server, which you would get from the, again, actually from a DNS server, where that is. And then based on that information, you set it up. But the reliance on it is strictly on the certificate, not on the DNS system. So they have shifted a little bit on where we put our trust in. So here we have a difference. STS first does not require DNS secure. It can be used on the normal DNS system, while DANE requires that you use DNS secure. STS defines a policy cache in the mail server. So if you communicate with the same user many times, you don't have to ask the DNS server each time. You have a cache in the server, so it's maybe a little bit more efficient there. It requires real valid certificates. You couldn't have self-signed certificates. You could have that with DANE actually. You need this extra policy server, and then you validate the transmission from the policy server and the certificate from a mail server during transmission. If you look at it from our side then, DANE does not require DNSSEC, as I said before. It has no policy cache, but we know that whenever we use the DNS system and send a request to our DNS resolver about an IP address somewhere, it will have a cache. So it won't go to the other side each time. It will have a cache that lasts for some time. So the cache is moved here to the DNS, our DNS resolver instead. And as I said, relies on the trust of the DNSSEC chain rather than the certificate authority. So they're a little bit different. If you look at the status of these two different protocols, DANE is more favored in Europe and STS is more favored in United States. But there are strong support behind both, which probably means that you would need to support both if you set up a mail server and would like to have secure communication. And they can coexist. There is no clash between them, so it's possible to do that. Okay, domain keys identify mail. That was where we were when we stopped last time. We said that what we do is we can sign an email when we send it out, and then it makes it possible for the receiver to check that the mail actually came from a certain domain that it claims to come from. And technically what we do is that we have again a certificate, or at least a hash of a certificate, in the DNS server. So this is where we ended off. We put information about our public key in the DNS server, and the receiving or the sending mail server signs with a private key, and when we receive it we can check, we can ask the DNS server. So it's very similar to Dane in that respect, that it put our trust into the DNS system to have information about the security. And this is the signature or the header that we add to an email. You will look at this in the assignment, so we don't have to go into details here. There were a number of attacks to see that RC mentions that domain keys could help against. Misuse of border length limit. If you try to send too big, well, then it wouldn't be signed, so it would stop there. Different DNS attacks, different DOS attacks, and yeah, there are a number of different attacks that it can at least partially help to handle. But mainly what it's doing is helping to handle spam and phishing, because that's the idea that if we receive something, we should be able to know if it actually came from that domain or not, and based on that we should be able to filter out quite a lot of spam and phishing attacks. Now we have a few more protocols to talk about. First one is this one, the Sender Policy Framework, which is a standardized ways to sending for a sender domain to identify and assert the mail sender for a given domain. So it seems that it's have a similar purpose as DKIM, having a domain taking control or be responsible for whatever it sends. But it's doing it in a bit different ways. It doesn't ask the DNS server for information. It doesn't have its signature. Instead, as you see, it's checking the sender's IP address, the policy encoding in SPF record found in the sending domain. So we have a policy again in the DNS server that we can check, and based on that, and that says that for a certain domain we should handle email in a certain way. For instance, we can limit that only certain IP addresses are allowed to send an email saying it came from, say, google.com, for instance. And if someone tries to send an email saying it came from google.com and it's not in this list of IP addresses, then it's an error. So we can say a policy for who can use this domain in some way. So this is how it looks like. The sender sends out an email. It reaches the inbound mail server for receiver. It will check on the DNS system, which of course will ask back to the authoritative DNS server for that domain about the SPF record. And then based on the policy we get there, we can decide on how to deal with this mail. Should we allow it to be delivered to the user, or should we discard it? There could also be, if it's something fishy with it, based on what the policy says, we can do different things with it. So we can put it in the e-box, we can put it in junk, quarantine it, or just delete it immediately. So the idea is that we should have some way to better filter email, really, based on information about where it comes from. So that's SPF. As you see, there is not very much about encryption so on in this standard. It's more about policy and getting a receiver to know the policy for a certain server. And then we have a last standard, the DMARC standard, which tries to incorporate both DKIM and SPF and an ability to also to report back about what have happened. So it's SPF plus DKIM plus a little bit more, you can say. Let's see. So again, DMARC have a policy like SPF saying who could send an email. It's using DKIM to sign all the emails, so we can do that type of validation. But then when the email arrives, like we have in this situation, when the email arrives, we have done the lookup, we have done different tests, and we made a decision about what we should do about that email. For DMARC now we do an extra step and say that, okay, in that policy we also have information about how we should report back to the sender about this. Because we got an email and it was apparently a fraud of some sort. And it claimed to be from a certain domain, but it wasn't. Earlier we just deleted it probably. But with DMARC we can also have a policy saying that we should report back that to the authority domain, saying that someone sends email claiming to be from your domain. And the policy can say that do that each time or just send a summarize log each week or something like that. So it's a way to get better knowledge about who is trying to misuse our domain. So that's, well, yeah, we have this, I forgot about this slide here, telling us that that is what we have at the bottom here, that once we decide what to do with, we can automatically send a failure report back to the sender about the result here. As with many protocols that are implemented, many different standards, sometimes it's not perfect, and DMARC had such a problem. As you see in 2014, Yahoo made a small change. The implementation is still the same, they just made a configuration change to reject some types of email. And they thought it would only affect spam. But what happened was that it affected a lot of, I think it was list servers. So a lot of mail that were using list servers suddenly were blocked for a while. And it was quite a huge part of the email that suddenly was just blocked automatically. So you have to be cautious when you implement something about how you do it and test it thoroughly. Is it used? Well, yes, quite a lot actually, as you see. About a year ago, 86% of major online businesses were using SPF. DMARC was not that much in use, only 10%, but it is a new standard. It will take time to implement it, so it is on the rise. And then lastly, we can see how the different things work together. End-to-end delivery, then we can use SMIME or PGP to create a message. We pass that on to our mail user agent, which is our mail server, who will use, it can be the same machine as this one, as the sending mail transfer agent. But what happens, what could happen at this stage is that we add this DKIM header, we sign it. And then it's delivered. When we deliver it, we will use hopefully either Dane or STS. And then we use, well, again, it's not completed because we should really have both DNS servers on both sides here and the interaction between them. But we're using that to set up a TNS tunnel between the sending and receiving MTA. Up here we have the sender DNS, but it only shows how we use it for the sender policy framework and for the DKIM information. But it's really the sender DNS that also is involved when we are getting the information for Dane or STS. But in either case, we use the DNS server to set up this tunnel. We send it. When it arrives, we collect the information about SPF to know the policy or DMARC, how to handle it, if it's any problem with it. If it's no problem, then of course we forward it to the receiver. Otherwise, we probably delete it, and if we use DMARC, we can also report back. So there are a lot of things working together here, and they're working a little bit on different levels, either on the transport level or end-to-end, and they do different things. But in all, they try to help making email more secure. But of course, in the end, it really depends on how we use the email system. Say as an example that we would like to send out spam. How can we do that without being caught by any of these systems? Well, as long as we have a legitimate email account, this system wouldn't help us. So say we are setting up an account at Yahoo, and then we start sending out spam from Yahoo. Well, it will be signed, and it will come from Yahoo, so it will be fine. It doesn't violate any policies. The delivery will be encrypted, but that doesn't help to fight spam. So the only way to fight spam in that regard is for the sender mail use agent, Yahoo in this case. They need to have some type of check on their users, what they're doing. So if a user sets up an account and starts sending millions of email, then it's probably suspicious at least. But neither of these standards will help in that case. Okay, any questions about any of these standards now? Okay, then we will start talking about today's topic, which is IP security. So, IP security is mainly handled by one protocol, which is called IPsec or IP secure. And that is what we'll talk about today, that protocol, which is really not just a protocol actually, but it's an entire family of protocols, but under the name IPsec. So we'll talk about different aspects of that. So this is the situation. We have one system on one side, we have another system on the other side. They are connected using some type of network. When we deliver something, we deliver it first on the local network. We come to a router who will find how we should forward it to eventually end up in a route on our system, and then it's local forwarding again. If you look at the TCP stack, all the different layers are of course involved here in this transmission. On the physical network here we have a physical level, we have a media access, we have a link layer control, and then we come up to the IP layer where we have end-to-end delivery from one network interface to another network interface, typically one computer to another computer on the internet. It doesn't really matter if it's local between two computers here or over network. So IP is the layer where we start finding end-to-end connection. And then on top of that we have TCP that we already talked about, what we can do on the transport layer and the application layer. But now we'll focus here on the IP layer and what type of security we can do on this layer. So this is the first level that reaches end-to-end. And of course that makes it interesting, because if we push down security even further into the protocol stack, then security will always only work on one link at a time, which could be interesting in some cases, of course, but it will always be limited to just one link at a time. So if we have delivery over internet and we put security below the IP layer, we will never handle the entire transport, only part of it. So the IP layer is the first chance to get protection end-to-end. And on the IP layer we have the internet protocol, of course, IP, but there are different versions of it, as you know. We have version 4 and version 6. And you should know a little bit about them. You should know that IP version 6 is a new one, that it's limited. They have reduced the amount of information in the basic header. But on the other side, the address part is much bigger, because IP version 6 addresses is much bigger. But these are the things that we have in the IP4 header. We talk about the version, which is 4 then. We have some flags. We have a type of service that can be used for a limited type of quality of service. We have a length. We have fragments. If we have to split up the packet on the way, we make fragments of it. We have time to live. What is time to live? What is that doing here? Number of hops, yeah, exactly. So whenever we pass a router, we decrease time to live, and when it reaches 0, we delete it. It's a way to make sure that packets just don't circle around forever in the network. And then we have this protocol field. What does this protocol field do?
It says protocol from the higher level of the containers.
Exactly. That the protocol tells us, because this is the header, and after the header we have a payload. And we need to know how to understand the payload. We need to know a way to decipher it. And that is what protocol says. It tells us, okay, what comes here is a TCP packet, for instance, or what it is. So that is what protocol tells us, what comes in the payload. So that's an important information. And then we have a checksum, and we have source and destination address, and possibly some options and padding that's not used much. If you look at the IP version 6 header, as I said, much fewer fields. But we still have what is called now, not a protocol, but instead next header, which is a similar thing. It tells us how we should interpret the payload, what type of protocol it is. And then we have, as you see, much more space for source address and destination address. What is also different is that although IP version 4 have these options in the header that makes it possible to extend a little bit and do different things there, it's not much used, and it's only an extension of the header. While in IP version 6 instead, we talk about a base header and then a number of additional headers. So typically in IP version 6 packet consists of first the base header and then a number of additional headers before we actually come to a payload. And each additional header has a purpose. It can be, for instance, source routing. It could be security, as we'll see now, or other things. So IPsec then. The idea of IPsec then is to establish a secure connection end-to-end from one IP address to another. And to do that, we need to have quite a few different protocols that will build that. We'll come back to that, of course. There are a number of ideas for how we can use IPsec. You can use it, as you see, secure branch office connectivity. So we are someone on the outside that calls into an office and gets secure connection. We can have what's called secure remote access over internet. Well, the first one is more that we have a satellite office with many people that is connected in. The second one is just one user who is out working somewhere and would like to call in. Then the third one, establish an extranet and internet. That is to set up more permanent links between different parties, and then it can be either one organization, or we can also include other organizations in extranets, giving them some access to our internal networks. And enhancing electronic commerce security, that is just a small added thing here. So this is what it looks like then when we use it. Down here we have two different parts of an organization, each with its own local network. So we have a number of users here, we have a number of users here. They are connected to the public internet through some type of router, of course. We also have up here a more free, just one user moving around, so they should be able to connect in a secure way as well. The idea with IPsec is that, well, in this case, if you're just a single user moving around, that means you need to be the end point of the security. You need to create the secure connection. So in this situation, you will make a secure packet directly with, as you see, an IP header and also an IPsec header, and then a secure payload. But in another situation, if you're a user within your secure network, it's your local network which you consider to be a secure domain. In that situation, you don't create encrypted packets. You create normal packets without any security. And you communicate with anyone else within this network without any security. But suddenly you would like to communicate with someone over here. And now it needs to be secure. But you don't need to know about that in the client. You just create a normal packet, it arrives to the router, and now the router instead makes it secure and passes it on through the network to the route on the other side, where it will be decapsulated. And we forward the normal packet again within the network. In this situation, with a client up here who creates a secure packet, it will be sent through the network, and when it arrives at the router, it will be decapsulated, and we will forward a normal unencrypted packet within the network. So these shows that there are different modes for IPsec, where we establish the secure connection, the secure point for it. Some benefits of IPsec. First, it's transparent application, because it is below the transport layer. The application just creates its own packet, whatever it is, and it creates a transport for it. You can choose UDP, TCP. It doesn't have to know anything about security. And then when the packet is pushed down to IP layer, it's at that stage that we add the security. So the application doesn't need to know about it. If we think back to transport layer security, SSL TLS, well, if you want to use SSL TLS, the application needs to know about it. It needs to be aware that it will use SSL TLS instead of just normal TCP UDP. So if we put it in a transport layer, it cannot be hidden for the user, unless we use the solution that Secure Shell is using, where we tunnel everything and we hide it from application. So in that regard, Secure Shell is more like IPsec, but the scope is very different, because in Secure Shell we only talk about one port, but we're protecting one port. We can of course set up Secure Shell to protect many different ports, but each port that we protect we need to configure separately. For IPsec, we can protect all the traffic that's going through one IP address. Doesn't matter which port it is. So we can protect all the traffic in one stroke here. And we can provide that without individual nodes even know about it. We put the security in the router. So individual clients or users doesn't need to know about it. So it can be very transparent to both users and applications. Well, there are some additional things, but that's not very important actually. So let's look at the security then. As you see, there are quite a few different RFCs involved here, standardized in different parts of IPsec. So first we have one that is describing architecture, so we know about all the different parts and can combine them. And then we have different parts. We have something called authentication header and one that is called encapsulated security payload. These are two main parts of how we can secure traffic. Then we have the internet key exchange. Since we need to be able to stop secure communication, we probably need to have some type of key exchange. So that is also part of the standard. And then there are a lot of different cryptographic algorithms that are also part of this framework. And then some other to talk about how to handle it. So all in all, the architecture or the framework is described like this. At the top we have architecture describing what we can do. Then we have ESP and authentication header protocols that describe how we do it. And then we have details about different encryption and authentication algorithms. And then we have down here something called the domain of interpretation to tell us how to combine different things and how to understand different things. And then at the bottom we have a key management. Well, I would perhaps put the key management higher up because it has to be used earlier in the process, but that's how I put it in the figure. So there are many different things. So what does IPsec give us then? What services? Well, these are the services that it could give us. Some of these are optional. It can give us access control. So we could know per user what we're doing and allow it. can give us call it connectionless integrity. And with that we mean if we're using UDP as a transport protocol, we don't have any integrity at all. It's a connectionless service without integrity. We send a packet. If it arrives, it arrives. If it doesn't arrive, well, okay, bad luck. With IPsec, we can still send UDP packets, but we do get some integrity because we get some feedback if a packet arrived or not. We don't get like TCP that we have automatic retransmission, so we have a security in that way, but we know at least what happened. And then we have what's called data region authentication. We know about where the data come from and that it's correct. It hasn't been changed. We can react replay packets. Again, that is something that, for instance, UDP couldn't give us. We couldn't see if it's a retransmission easily, but here we can do it. And then perhaps the main thing, confidentiality, that we can encrypt packets so no one can read into our communication. And then we have what's called a limited traffic flow confidentiality. With that we mean that someone on the outside observing our traffic, if we don't use IPsec, they can see exactly who is communicating with who at what time, what protocol they're using and so on. Even if we encrypt the payload, like if we're using PGP or S-MIME, for instance, they can still see who is sending email to who. With IPsec, we hide all the traffic within one tunnel. We can see something's going on, but we don't really know who it is or what it is. And that is what we mean limited traffic flow confidentiality. We hide most of the details about who is communicating and what we're doing. So this is a more detailed part of the architecture, what we can do. We have two parts here, of course. As a base, we have the IPsec protocol, which is in version 3 currently. Together with that, we have the Internet Key Exchange protocol, which is in version 2 currently. As you see, it's separate from IPsec because it is actually a separate protocol. You can use the Internet Key Exchange in other situations as well, so it's not bound to IPsec. But it's an important part of using IPsec is to use this iKey protocol as well. So up here we have key exchange, of course, and down here we are sending data that is protected using some of the protocols in IPsec. We have two different databases. Let's see, we have a security association database on both sides, and we also have a security policy database. And the idea is that the policy database is used whenever we set up a connection to a new node somewhere. We would like to start to send a packet over to a branch office, and we haven't established a connection already. At that stage, we use a policy database to check, okay, what have we decided? Whenever we are communicating with that branch office, how should we protect that? Should we protect all traffic, or should we only protect certain services? Should all IP addresses within our network be protected, or just some of them? At what level? What type of protocol should we use? What type of encryption algorithm? So this is the policy that we set up on how to protect different type of traffic. And here we can actually decide very precisely. We can say that it's only if this computer communicates with another computer somewhere and they are sending, let's say, web traffic. It's only in that situation that we will actually use IPsec. Or we can say it very generally, that anytime we send something out from this node to any other IP address, it has to be protected. So it can be, the policy can be very different here. Once we know the policy for it, we have to establish a security association. We have to establish this connection between the different two nodes. So they can start talking about each other. And between two nodes, we can have many different security associations going on in parallel. So this database tells us about all the different active sessions that we're having. So if a policy says that for web traffic we should encrypt it with a certain algorithm, then we have to create security association for that. And then the next packet we send is an email. And then we have another policy. That means we have to negotiate another security association, even if it's between the two same nodes. But then, of course, this node probably communicates with many other different nodes, which means that we need different security associations for each one. So typically, the policy might hold just a few lines telling us how to deal with it, or it can be very precise, having hundreds of lines. The security association typically holds, well, it depends on, for a single user who's using IPsec out somewhere, the security association may only hold a few active security associations in the database. But for a router that is connecting internet to a big network, we can have thousands of associations going on at the same time here. Okay, I think this is a good time to take a break before we start going to some of the other details of the protocol. So let's take a break until 7:15 then. Strange. Yep.
I didn't send the free assignment.
Yeah, I saw that comment from Ures yesterday. I haven't had time to think about it.
I've already fixed them to a PDF file. I thought it was when I couldn't find the submit file. But then I just made it as a comment.
But where do you send it?
I tried to send it to the assistant teacher, but he says
Yeah, but you did it now, not before.
no. He says we don't accept submission by
No, exactly. That's the rule. So I will have to think about it.
Okay.
See what to do. So I will get back to you.
Okay.
Hallå? Right, so let's continue then. We talked about these two different modes where you can either have someone moving around wanting to call in, or a more fixed structure where you have two different branches connected to each other. And they are handled by these two modes, transport mode or tunnel mode. Both transport mode and tunnel mode can protect the traffic in different ways. So we'll see the combination of these modes with the different protocols briefly. But the idea is that transport mode is more end-to-end. It's one user connecting to, well, it could be to a gateway or to another user. Which means that when you use transport mode, we know exactly who is at least on one side. We know which client it is. We couldn't hide that because that is the client who's actually using IPsec. That means there are some limitations to what we can hide. In tunnel mode, on the other hand, it's always two gateways that are talking to each other. And those gateways typically service a number of clients behind them, which means that we don't know when we enter, we see traffic in the tunnel, we don't really know who it came from, what specific client it was. It's also the case that transport mode has to be able to find its way from anywhere to a certain place. While tunnel mode is just two gateways talking, but in reality there are two clients behind those gateways that are talking. But it's not the original IP header that is used to forward a packet. So we have to handle the traffic in different ways for these two modes. So we have actually these two modes, transport mode, tunnel mode, and we have three different ways to handle the packets in terms of different protocols in IPsec. We have what's called authentication header, and then we have encapsulated security payload, ESP, with or without authentication. So if you look at the top row then, with authentication header, what we're doing is that we are just authenticating the packet. We don't encrypt it. We are authenticating, making sure that we know where it comes from, it hasn't been changed. But there are different things that are authenticated in transport mode and tunnel mode, and we'll see the details of that shortly. ESP, with ESP we are doing encryption, confidentiality, that's what we're after. And in transport mode, we encrypt the payload of a packet and some headers, but not everything. With tunnel mode, we encrypt everything. So the scope is a little bit different here on what we can encrypt. And if we also add authentication, which we can do with ESP, then we have both confidentiality and authentication, integrity. And then again, we encrypt different parts. So we have these 6 combinations of what we can do. In reality today, the authentication header protocol is not used that much. So we are mainly using ESP with or without authentication. But authentication header is still a valid protocol to use. And in some sense, it's better than the authentication we have in ESP. So, well, this just again shows the two ideas. Transport is end-to-end, while tunnel mode goes from different gateways, but not all the way end-to-end to the clients. And these are typical situations when we can set up the different modes. So transport mode is just computer communicating, while here we can set up different types of tunnels between different sites. And the clients here, whenever they're communicating with any client on another site here, it looks like we are communicating locally, and we have the same security as we are communicating locally, even if we actually encrypt the traffic through these tunnels through the internet. The security association, as I said, we need a database of security association, way to identify how to handle different type of traffic streams. And as you see, we're talking a one-way relationship between a sender and receiver that, well, handles the security for that flow. And defined by 3 parameters, we have something called a security parameter index, which is more or less a random number. And then we have an IP destination address and the security protocol identifier. Why it's not enough to just use the IP address and which protocol we're using is, as I said before, between 2 IP addresses we can have many different types of associations for different type of traffic. So we need more than knowing exactly what host it is and what protocol we're using. And this is what a security association consists of, the information we have in it. Of course, we have the identification, the security parameter index and address and so on. But then we also have, as you see, a sequence number counter, so we can keep track of where the packet belongs into sequence. We have something called an overflow, so we can handle replay packets. That's also by this anti-replay window that is helping with that. Then we have information about the different protocols we're using. If we're using a authentication header or an encapsulated security payload. Lifetime for it, which mode, transport to tunnel, and a path MTU. What is the path MTU? Maximum transmission unit, yeah. And how is that used normally? Yeah, we know that is when we are sending packet through this, we see that sometimes packets will be fragmented. And if they are fragmented, that is that we have gone over the maximum transmission unit for some part of a network. Then we can reduce the size of packets, so packets can go through without fragmentation, and that is more efficient to do that. So that's why we have is to make it efficient, so we don't have to fragment packets that we are sending. And we also have the policy database, and this is what the policy database could say. It could say, for instance, in the first row here, it says that UDP packets from a local IP, which is 123.1.1, which is probably our gateway here, on port 500 should bypass IPsec. And the reason for that is that this port 500 and protocol UDP is used by this Internet Key Exchange protocol. And when we use the Internet Key Exchange, that is when we would like to set up a secure communication. And Internet Key Exchange is secure by itself, so we don't really need IPsec to secure it. And it would be impossible to do it because we couldn't use IPsec before we have actually set up an association, so we need to bypass that. Then we say that we should also bypass all ICMP messages. That shouldn't be protected. And then we say that anything to a certain remote address here, 1230/24, which is then an entire network, on any port should be protected with ESP. So here we say that any protocol from inside except UDP and ICMP that is going to a specific other network somewhere on the internet should be protected with ESP. And then we say that TCP traffic to a certain web server on port 80 here, 124.10, should also be protected with ESP. So we can very specifically say how we should handle different type of traffic flow. So this is the policy we're building up. And this is just the processing, how we are in very general terms. We start up with see, this is outbound packets. So this is a packet that should be sent out first. We check in the policy database. If there's no match, we'll discard it. If we don't have a policy of this type of packet, we shouldn't handle it at all. If we find a match, then we determine what policy we should use. And if a policy says bypass, well, then we just send it out without any security at all. If it says that it should protect it, well, then we go and see, do we already have a secure association for this packet or not? If we have, well, yeah, then we use it and process it in whatever way needed. If we don't have a security association for it already, well, then we need to create that, and then we'll kick in the Internet Key Exchange protocol to create that association, and then we use it. And inbound is just the reverse here. So every packet is checked against the policy and what security association we should use. Now let's look at the details then. Here we have the authentication header protocol. And here we see the packet, how it looks like before we apply authentication header, both for IPv4 and IPv6. So this is just normal how it looks. We have the header here, and then this is really the boundary for the payload. And in this case, it's a TCP segment. So we have a TCP header and then the TCP data. And here we have for IPv6 then. Again, we have the base header, and then we have some extension headers, if present, depends on what we have. And then this is again really the division between the payloads. So again, we have a TCP packet. If we now use authentication header, the idea is to authenticate. And how do we typically authenticate the packet? Yeah, we have some type of signature, some type of message authentication code. So we have to take a hash of a packet and possibly sign it, depending on what type of security we would like to have. But we need a message authentication code. So that is something we have to calculate and then send on with a packet. And this is what it looks like then. For IPv4, what we do now is that we insert a new header here, this authentication header. And when IPsec was created, IPv4 was already established. So IPsec came later than IPv4, which means that IPv4 doesn't know about IPsec. What that means is that this authentication header is not known for IPv4, which means that it has to actually go into the payload. So that's what happened here. This is the division between the header and the payload. So authentication header and the TCP header all are part of a payload of an IP packet. And what we say here in protocol is that instead of pointing to a TCP, we actually point into saying that it's an authentication header protocol that is the payload of a packet. For version 6, it's a bit different because when version 6 was established, IPsec were already here. And then they could merge it together. So IPsec is more or less part of IP version. Yeah, IPsec and IPsec are merged together more or less. So for that reason, this authentication header is one of the possible extension headers that we have for IP version 6. So we have a base header, and then we have some headers that is possible, hop destination routing fragments on. Then we can have this authentication header, and then there can be some other headers. And then we have the payload starting over here with the TCP header. So that's a little bit different. Now, this is for transport mode. And in transport mode, what we do is we take the packet that we have and we just change it a little bit. In tunnel mode, we do another thing. What we do now is we create a new packet. So from here, we have the original packet without any changes. And then we encapsulate that into a new IP packet with a new IP header. And this is where payload starts in the outer IP packet with an authentication header. And then the content is now the original datagram. And IP version 6, it's the same. We encapsulate into a new datagram. So as you see here, we start, this is the additional line for the original datagram, which is exactly as it was when it arrived. But now we add a new header or headers to it, so it's a new datagram. We can also see the extent of authentication. In transport mode here, we say that authentication except for mutable fields. What is a mutable field? Anyone know that? Oh, well, a mutable field is a field that could change during transmission. So can you give an example of a field in the IP header that can change during transmission? Time to live, yeah, that's an example. Fragment, offset, that can change. So there are a few fields that normally can change. But there are some fields that shouldn't change, like source and destination address. Those shouldn't change. So what we do is here, when we are calculating the hash, we do it on all the data except these fields that could change. Because then when it arrives on our side and we create a new hash, if some fields have changed that is part of a hash, then of course it wouldn't match any longer. So we have to exclude those. And for IP version 6 it's the same. We take all headers except everything that can change during translation, but normally can change. And in tunnel mode, we do authentication for everything in the original datagram, including mutable fields. Because this encapsulated datagram will just be carried on as payload. No one will look at this header until it arrives to the other side and will be decapsulated, which means that nothing here will change. But the new header, that is what will actually be used to transport the packet over internet. And here are mutable fields. And the similar idea for version 6 one. This is the actual header for authentication header. So it's not very much. We have something called next header, and that is pointing to what comes next, which is normally then a TCP segment or a UDP packet. We have a length. We have this security parameter index that matches us against the security association. We have a sequence number, so we tell where it is in the flow. And then we have authentication data, that is this message authentication code, signed hash. I think we can skip that, and then we go into the ESP instead. That will give us confidentiality then instead. So now we have the same idea as authentication header. We create the packet when we send it on, and we still have both tunnel mode and transport mode, but now instead of doing a hash and sign it, we actually have to encrypt the data. So this is the header format for ESP. Again, we start with the security parameter index and the sequence number. But then we have optional initialization values. Depending on what algorithms we use, we know that some encryption algorithms or hashing algorithms requires an initialization value. Then we have the rest of the payload, which is encrypted. So within the header, we have all the encrypted data that came from the original packet. Then we have some padding if needed. And then it points to the next header. And here we have an integrity check value, so we can just check. So you can see that encryption is covering this part of it, the payload. That's why it's called the encapsulating security payload. We are encapsulating some data that comes and we encrypt it. So to the details. Here we have again IP version 4 and IP version 6. Now we have in transport mode first. And transport mode means that we take the original datagram and we just change it a little bit before we pass it on. We don't create a new datagram. So in IP version 4 we have the original header. We have the original data, which is this part, TCP and data. That is what was original in the payload. What you do now is actually we squeeze that in. So we push in a new ESP header, the thing we have up here, before the data. And the data is now encrypted. And then we add the trailer here, the part that we have down here, integrity check value and optional padding and so on. So we have really encapsulated, in this case, a TCP segment with a TCP header and data between the header and trailer for ESP. And for IP version 6, similar. We have original header, we have some extension headers, and when we push in this new ESP header, we just insert it into the original datagram. We encrypt the rest of the packet, which actually could consist of some other optional extension headers. And then, in this case, a TCP header and segment, and then the trailer at the end here. So we squeeze in the headers within the existing datagrams. While in transport mode, it's a little bit more easier actually, because we take the original datagram, which is this one, and then we just create a new packet with a new header, an extension header, and then we encrypt the original datagram. And similar for IP version 6. Now, as you see, in this case, we have also added ESP with encryption and authentication. We said that ESP can be with or without authentication. And here we can see the extent then of the encryption and authentication. The encryption only covers the original datagram. And you can see that that is the case both for IP version 6 and IP version 4. And it's the case for both transport mode that we have here and tunnel mode. So it's only the original datagram that is protected. And in the transport mode, it's actually only the payload, which is quite obvious. Why couldn't we encrypt the header here? Well, think about what happens if we take a datagram and we encrypt everything, both payload as we've done here, but if we'd also encrypted the original header. And then we take that datagram and send it to the next router. Exactly. The next router wouldn't know what to do with it. Everything would be encrypted. It would have no chance to deliver it. So we need to keep the header still in clear text, so routers on the way can actually deliver it. But we can also see that authentication is not as extended as for the authentication, because authentication only handles also again the payload, not the original header. We don't authenticate anything in the original header, either for version 6 or 4. And for tunnel mode, again, the new outer headers are not authenticated. In transport mode, we authenticate all the non-mutable fields. So it's a little bit less secure in terms of authentication compared to the authentication header protocol. Any questions about this? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, good question. If we take the tunnel mode, we have now a packet that has a new header. We have the old header, and then we have a payload. As a simplification, we have that. We have this outer packet and we have an inner packet. If we now have a situation, we have a client on a local network, and then we have the router that is also where we handle IPsec, and then we have a network, another router, another local network, and another client. So now, let's see if I can have a better pen here. Of course, the idea is that here at the client, we create this packet with header and payload. And when it arrives at the router, then we create this new old payload. So the new payload here, the IP address of this new payload will connect router to router. So when it arrives here and we add this outer header, the recipient here will be the other router here. While the inner packet, the IP down here, well, that will be the IP of the client. So it will be client to client. So that's the difference between the inner head and the outer head. The inner header is end-to-end, while the outer header is just site to site. And when it arrives here, we decapsulate it, we remove outer header, and we forward the inner packet after checking that it's still secure. So that's right. Anything else?
Isn't it possible for the intruder to decapsulate it? Like, what means by decapsulating?
Well, an intruder who would like to attack this, well, say we're using this ESP with authentication and IP version 4. We can take that as well, it will be similar. So an attacker on the internet, somewhere here, out on the internet, would get this packet. That's what he can get then out on the internet. Well, what can he do with? Well, he can see that this header here is in clear text, so that he can read. And he can see that the packet should be delivered to this router. If he tries to look further into the packet, he couldn't see anything because all of this is encrypted. So he couldn't see actually who this client is, and he couldn't access the information because it's encrypted. And it's encrypted with a key that we have shared between the two parties, so it should be a secure key exchange. So an intruder wouldn't be able to decrypt it. He can, of course, remove outer header and see the inner packet, but it will be encrypted, so it couldn't do anything with it. If we only use authentication, on the other hand, well, in that case, of course, an intruder that captures this packet will be very similar to this situation. It's just that now we haven't encrypted the payload. So in that case, an intruder could go in and see everything here. So he could read the packet. So with authentication header, we don't get confidentiality. That's not the purpose. But if that intruder tries to change the packet and then pass it on, then we would find out about that, because then the hash wouldn't match any longer, the encrypted hash. So we have authentication. Okay, so this just tries to summarize the different levels here of where we are in the protocol stack. An application for transport mode that we have over here. An application creates some data. We add a TCP header if it's TCP, or it could be UDP header, of course. At the IP, we create an original IP header. If we now use IPsec, IPsec will be a sublayer to IP. It will still be on the network layer, but it will be a sublayer below IP. So then we will change this packet a little bit. We will insert this new header here and the trailers, but it will still be the same original packet. In tunnel mode, it will be, instead that we create the data, we add the transport header, we add the original data header or IP header, and then we encapsulate everything into a new IP. So we will go through IP, IPsec, and then we can say that we push it back to IP to add a new IP header again. So it will be taking one more step through IP to create another IP. And that will not be encrypted again normally, but it could actually. We could take this output, and then when we try to send it out, we will again go through the security policy. And the security policy says that, well, this type of traffic should be encrypted again. So we push it down to IPsec to add one more level of security around it. And then again, go back to IP to add a new header, and then we can go on for that for a while. So what we can do is we can layer many different security associations on to each other. And that is actually what we'll talk about next here, combining security associations. One individual security association only implements either authentication header or ESP, but not both. But by combining several authentication or several security associations, we can actually get the protection from both protocols. Of course, at the cost of doing more computation, we would have to go through the protocol one more time and do all the computations again. But the security will also be greater, of course. So then we talk about the security association bundles. And there are two types, transport adjacency or iterated tunneling. But what is really interesting is that we talk about different typical situations for these bundles. So they have 4 different cases for it, how we can set up security associations. So this is the first one. One or more security associations end to end. So as you see, we have, in this case, several transport contacts layered on top of each other. First we have an authentication header, and then we have an ESP probably. So we have added them together like that. The second case is a simple tunnel mode between 2 gateways. So that's not really a bundle, but it's a type of association. Then we have a combination of the first 2. We have a tunnel between gateways, and then we have transport contacts between clients. So first we encrypt it over here in the client. First, probably with authentication header, and then we put a layer of ESP around it to encrypt it. And then we forward it to the gateway, and at the gateway we encrypt it again, add a tunnel mode, and then when it arrives to the gateway on the other side, we remove the first layer of protection, and then we forward packets to the client who removes the other 2 layers of protection. We can combine associations like that. And the last case is if we have a remote user who is connecting to a site. Then we normally have a tunnel between the user and the security gateway. But then inside that tunnel, we can again have one or 2 security associations end to end. So there are many possible ways to combine security associations. Then we need the key exchange, key management. Because the idea is that 2 different nodes communicate with each other. Well, to do that in a secure way, we would use some type of public key scheme. When we sign, we use our private key. When we encrypt, we use our the recipient's public key. So we need public keys and private keys. And that means we need to be able to deliver keys in a secure way. Session keys for the actual communication. So, if we look at what keys are used, let's see, we typically need 2 pairs of keys for a security association, 2 per direction. Because when it's set up so a security association, we have traffic flowing in both directions. We can send and we can receive, of course. And we can both have for authentication and we can have for encryption. So that means we need 2 keys one for authentication, one for encryption in one direction, and 2 keys for the other direction. So typically for each security association, we need 4 keys, actually. But 2 options for how to handle key management. We can, of course, do it manually. And that can work in situations when we don't have too many users or too many nodes for IPsec. Say, for instance, that we are setting up a branch office. In that case, we only need to establish keys in the 2 gateways. So it's only in 2 places. That can easily be done manually. Or say that we have 5 users, mobile users moving around who need to be able to call in. Well, we need to configure those 5 users then. So that can be handled. But say an organization with thousands of users, well, then it's not really an option to do it manually anymore. So then we need an automated key management instead. And if we use the automated key management, we are using actually a couple of protocols to do that. We are using basic elements which are called Oakley and ISAC-MP, which are two different standards, which together gives this internet key exchange that we talked about before. So internet key exchange is a protocol for, as I say, automated system for on-demand creation and distribution of keys. So we can set up association with a new node, and then iKey can automatically create the keys that is needed for this new node. The way we are creating these keys is with a version of this Diffie-Hellman protocol that we've seen before. The different parts of this is, as I said, we say that this internet is really two other protocols in the behind, this ISAC-MP and the Oakley protocol. The Oakley part of that is the actual key exchange based on Diffie-Hellman, but with some additions, because basic Diffie-Hellman have some weaknesses. It's vulnerable for man-in-the-middle attacks, for instance. So there are some extensions that are maybe not obvious. As you see, we talk about we're adding something called cookies, groups, nonces, and then we have an authenticated key exchange. So we have to add quite a few of pieces of information during the key exchange to make it secure against man-in-the-middle attacks mainly. But Oakley is a well-known protocol for that, and it works. We need to authenticate in some way. Say a new user logs in, saying that I am a user, I would like to log into your network and set up a secure association. Well, they need to authenticate somehow before we actually start to create keys and let them in. As you see, Oakley then is used in that for the authentication, and we have these three different ways with digital signatures, public key encryption, or symmetric key encryption. The last one would require that we actually have some, as I say, out-of-band mechanism, some manual probably way to deliver this symmetric key encryption. But this would be similar to give a user a password. Say, okay, this is your password when you need to log into our IPsec gateway. While the other two is based on public key encryption, it doesn't require that. Then we have ISAC-MP part, which is really, as I say, it's called Internet Security Association and Key Management Protocol. So it's really a protocol of how to handle security association and packet formats on how to negotiate them. So iKey is not only a protocol for exchanging keys, but it's also a protocol for actually establishing these security associations between the two nodes. So it's a framework for that, to establish, negotiate, modify, delete security association, and with the Oakley protocol then we are exchanging the keys, and then we are ready to go. It's two phases. Again, we don't have to go into much of a detail. There's a package format for it, again with lots of different headers. Don't go into the details here. Know that there is a packet format for ISAC-MP, so we can actually establish these security associations. Again, you see we have cookies, we have next payload, so this will be part of the IPsec as an extension head to IP version 6. The payloads can be of different sort here. Typically it's used for setting up a security association, but payloads can be that we are sending information about certificates to authenticate. and but it can also be reporting about problems of setting up a security association. So as I said, there are quite a lot of different types of payloads we can carry in this ISAC MP. But they all needed to handle security associations. So that's the main idea here. And well, and then we talk about different exchange types as well. If we are, what type of exchanges is needed. So as you see, it's quite complicated protocol. There are a lot of different formats, there are different types of payload, and there are these different exchange types, how we need to exchange information between sender and receiver in different situations. So it's a complex protocol, but you don't need to know all the details about it. If you look a little bit on algorithms, that has changed a little bit of them. So that's one of the changes from earlier versions of IPsec. So here we have IPsec version 2, as you see, where we talk about FreeDES, RC5, Blowfish and so on, and for authentication, MD5 and SHA-1. And as you know, some of these are not really secure anymore. So that's one of the reasons for why we have changed it for IPsec version 3. So as you see now, it's much more locked down. For encryption, we should use AES, and for authentication, it's again actually not a normal hash algorithm, but we use a cipher-based MAC message authentication code. We're actually encrypting the information in a certain way, this cipher-based MAC way, to create a hash code. So we don't encrypt and give a big message that is the same size that is normally done with encryption. So it is a hash algorithm, but it's based on an encryption instead. Additionally, as you see, there are some other cipher suits that is defined in the standard that is only used by the typically American military or administration, that is not available for others, which is a little bit fishy perhaps, but yeah, that's the case. Some limitations of IPsec. Cannot provide end-to-end security in the sense that it's only interface to interface. Whenever the packet arrives to a node, it will be decrypted. So it will be in clear text in the node. Think about email security, for instance. When you receive an email, it will still be encrypted until you decide to decrypt it. So it will be secured all the way end to end until you actually use it. Here it will not be secured, either when it arrives to a node, or even worse, if you see it in that way, when it arrives to a gateway. So in the internal network, it will be vulnerable for attacks if you have an insider attacker. Another limitation might be that you can only, you get what you get. It couldn't do much about giving special needs for special applications. So you do confidentiality and or authentication, but nothing else. So if you need other things, you would need to add it, to have it in the application layer. But that's natural, and I don't see these limitations as really a problem, because you do put security on different levels in the TCP/IP stack, and depending on where you put them, you have different benefits and different limitations with it. So as long as you know that, it's not really a problem. Lastly, virtual private network is a concept. And you can build these virtual private networks in different ways. But virtual private network looks a lot like what we've seen here when we have this picture here. I mean, a picture like what's long? This one, where we have different connections through a public internet connecting different sites. I mean, that is typically what we think about when we say a virtual private network. But also the top figure, when we are connecting two different sites and try to protect them, that is also a virtual private network. So VPN is a concept that we use, and VPN can be implemented with IPsec, but it's not the only possible solution. As I said, there are quite a lot of different other protocols that can be used to build VPNs. But that is something we'll look more in the next course, different ways to build VPN connections with different protocols. It can be quite tricky to select which of these protocols you're going to use. IPsec is one option. It's a good option, but it's a quite heavy option when you configure it. It's not something you just install as an application, then you're up and running. You need to actually establish it quite a lot in an organization, make sure that the key exchange works, and decide on algorithms. So it's a more heavy solution than, for instance, using SSL TLS to build VPNs. But all solutions have different limitations, and IPsec is probably the one that is closest to how we expect a VPN to work. But yeah, so different limitations, different problems with them. Okay, any last question now before we stop for today? There's no lecture tomorrow, so now we reduce the number of lectures to 2 each week instead until we're finished. So meet you next week then. Get started with practice work if you didn't. It will take some time, so make sure to work on it. Okay, thank you for today.